Hi, welcome back for more encouragement on your Bible reading. Theory, if you've been keeping up with Genesis at a regular pace, you are probably into the latter portion of the book of Genesis. If not, you should soon be there. And you should be into the stories of the patriarchs. Genesis describes these as the generations of Terah, of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And these stories are full of amazing and incredibly vivid scenes that run the full gamut of human drama. Stories about leaving home and finding a spouse, and the issue of childlessness and sibling rivalry and rape and murder and false imprisonment and economic depression and every other thing. These are the kind of things that can certainly make the news, which people are certainly concerned about, especially when it's personal. And in those, that is in your reading of those stories, you should see something emerging, this idea of the continual interest and intervention of God into the affairs of men. Whereas if you go back to the beginning of Genesis and the creation narrative, there's no doubt about God's presence, his sovereignty. He's creating all things out of nothing. You see him as the actor on the stage. But then that could also be said to a certain degree in the generations of Adam and of Noah. God is still intervening in these global ways when he curses all the creation because of Adam's sin, or when he brings the universal flood because of the continued sin of man, or when he causes the destruction of the Tower of Babel and disperses languages across the earth. It indicates that God is present. He is judging and working. But then when you get to chapter 12 in Genesis, the story very much narrows. God's intervening is now taking place in special ways in the lives of individuals. And the story becomes primarily concerned with really one family over 4 generations: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob, along with Jacob. And so when that happens, I want you to continue to pay attention, because even though the drama of how God acts may not be the same as in the very beginning, it is absolutely still there. And you will still see God continue to work in one of two ways. The first way is when God will speak directly or specially into the lives of his people. And the text will clearly declare to us what God did. Such as when he calls Abraham in Genesis 12. There's no doubt God shows up on the scene in some way and he speaks to Abraham audibly and clearly, calling him to leave. Or when God warns Abraham about the impending judgment that's going to fall on Sodom. That's a clear interaction of God with man. There's also the case in Genesis 20, whenever God warns Abimelech in a dream about what he had done in taking Abram's wife Sarah. And then there's the occasion, of course, in Genesis 32, where God reveals himself to Jacob and he wrestles with him. You can't get much more direct than that. All these are manifestly supernatural events in Genesis that declare to us how God was working. But then you should also notice and pay attention in your reading to the times when God is still powerfully working, but he's working quietly. And you can see those, for instance, whenever God protects Sarah in the house of Pharaoh, similar to the house of Abimelech. But in this case, there are terrible consequences that fall upon Pharaoh and his house while Abraham is being blessed. But we're not told the how or the why or the who, but we know. Or you have the case of Genesis 24, where there's this provision of Rebekah as a wife for Isaac. And it's a strange story where a servant is sent out to acquire the wife, and he prays a prayer, and God responds to this prayer. Although we're not told that God responded, he does respond, and the servant gives praise to God for it. So God is quietly working, but working. Or in the dream that he gives to Joseph in Genesis 37, we're not told the dream was given to him by God, although it certainly proves to be true in time, but you have to wait all the way until Genesis chapter 50 when you see that resolved. On those occasions, the narrator may not tell you that God is the agent, but the people and the circumstances certainly do. As you read those stories, it should be an occasion for you to get to know your God better and to know how he interacts with his people better. This was something that our spiritual forefathers wanted to instruct us in our confession of faith. Chapter 5 speaks of God's providence. And this is what it says in the first paragraph. God, the creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures actions and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness, and mercy. That tells you how to read Genesis, to the praise of his glory. And then the last paragraph in chapter 5 of God's providence in the confession says this: as the providence of God doth in general reach to all creatures, so after a most special manner it taketh care of his church, and disposeth all things to the good thereof. Genesis certainly bears witness to that God cares especially about his people. And so when you're reading, pay attention to the fact that God, whether he arrives on the scene and speaks openly or he's working quietly on the background, he knows his people and he cares for them, and he is active in doing so. When they're a stranger in a strange land, when sin shows up again and ruins another good situation, when people have been slandered, or when they've been put in prison, or when a situation seems beyond hope, it doesn't matter. Their God is working, their God is loving his people and doing them good. And that's as much true now as it ever was. So be encouraged by your reading, the love of God and the activity of God at all times. Thanks. Hope to see you again soon.